In the early hours of November 13th, 2022, Moscow, Idaho was quiet in the way only a small college town can be, the kind of silence that follows a Saturday night when lights go off one by one and students drift home, believing the weekend is almost over. At 1122 King Road, a rented off-campus house just steps from the University of Idaho, life had followed a familiar rhythm. Friends came and went. Laughter echoed earlier in the night. There was no sign that this house, known for its social warmth, would soon become the center of one of the most unsettling murder cases in recent American history. Inside were four students who would not see the morning: Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin. They were not strangers to danger, nor were they living recklessly by any legal measure. They were doing what thousands of students across the country do every weekend, returning home after nights out, texting friends, scrolling phones, settling into beds that felt safe. That sense of safety, investigators would later say, is often the most fragile thing of all. Kaylee Goncalves and Madison Mogen had spent part of the evening at a local bar before being seen at a food truck shortly after 1:30 a.m., laughing, waiting for late-night food, behaving like young women who believed they had many years ahead of them. They were dropped back at the house around 1:56 a.m. Xana Kernodle and her boyfriend Ethan Chapin had attended a fraternity party earlier that night and returned sometime before 2:00 a.m. Two other roommates were also in the house, already asleep on the lower floor. Everyone, as far as the evidence shows, was alive and unharmed when the house settled into silence. What happened next would later be reconstructed not from eyewitnesses, but from fragments of surviving roommates' memory, phone records, security footage from neighboring homes, and forensic evidence that spoke without emotion. Sometime after 4:00 a.m., an intruder entered the residence. Investigators believe the house was targeted, though for weeks the reason why remained a haunting question. There were no signs of forced entry, no shattered windows, no alarms triggered. The killer moved quietly, deliberately, as though familiarity or confidence guided each step. The first attacks occurred while the victims were in bed. They were asleep or close to it. There was no prolonged struggle that alerted the entire house, no screams captured on record. Later, authorities would confirm that a large fixed-blade knife was used, a weapon requiring proximity, strength, and intent. This was not impulsive violence. It was personal, brutal, and fast. Each victim suffered fatal stab wounds. The brutality of the scene would shock even seasoned investigators. One surviving roommate would later tell police she heard noises during the night, sounds she initially dismissed as ordinary: someone play with a dog, someone moving around upstairs. At approximately 4:17 a.m., a nearby security camera captured distorted audio of whimpering, a loud thud and barking. Inside the house, confusion lingered in the dark. At one point, the roommate opened her door and saw a masked figure dressed in black walking past her toward the sliding glass door. The man did not speak. He did not run. He walked out of the house and vanished into the night. She locked her door and remained frozen in fear. It would be hours before the full truth was discovered. When the sun rose over Moscow, it illuminated a nightmare no one had imagined. Just before noon, a 911 call was placed in the house, reporting an unconscious person. Friends had arrived after attempts to reach the residence went unanswered. The dispatcher did not yet know they were responding to a quadruple homicide. But inside, first responders were confronted with a scene of overwhelming violence. For young lives had ended where they believed they were safest. News spread quickly, first through campus whispers, then across the nation. A tight-knit community recoiled in disbelief. Parents kept their children close. Students packed bags and left town. The question on everyone's mind was the same: how could something like this happen here? Moscow was not known for violent crime. It was a place where people forgot to lock doors. In the days that followed, fear turned into frustration. Police initially said there was no ongoing threat to the community, then clarified that the attack appeared targeted. The absence of an immediate suspect fueled anxiety. Candlelight vigils were held as families mourned publicly, clinging to photos of smiling faces now frozen in time. Kaylee, who was set to graduate early and move to Texas. Madison, her best friend, inseparable until the end. Xana, energetic and outspoken. Ethan, remembered as gentle and kind. For separate futures erased in a single night. Behind the scenes, investigators worked around the clock. The house became a sealed crime scene. Every footprint, every fiber, every drop of blood was documented. The lack of a murder weapon intensified pressure. There were no eyewitnesses who could identify the attacker. Yet investigators believed something else had been left behind, not intentionally, but inevitably. In crimes like this, perfection is a myth. The smallest oversight can unravel everything. As days stretched into weeks, the case drew national and international attention. True crime audiences dissected timelines. Rumors flooded social media. Families begged for patience and accuracy. Law enforcement remained largely silent, revealing little beyond assurances that progress was being made. What the public did not yet know was that the story of this crime would not be defined by mystery alone, but by mistakes human, digital, and behavioral that would slowly bring a suspect into focus. The first 5 minutes of this case are not about how the killer was caught. They are about loss, vulnerability, and the terrifying reality that violence does not always announce itself. Sometimes it slips through a door you forgot to lock, moves through a familiar space, and leaves behind devastation that cannot be undone. The rest of the story would expose how even a calculated offender cannot escape the traces of his own actions. Long before an arrest was made, the Idaho Student Murders began to speak through machines. Not through confessions or witnesses, but through the quiet, unblinking systems that now record modern life security cameras, cell towers, timestamps, and data logs that never forget. While the public waited in frustration, investigators followed these digital shadows, knowing that even the most careful offender leaves a trail when he moves through a world wired for observation. The first critical break came from outside the house, not within it. Canvassing the neighborhood, police collected footage from residential security cameras and nearby businesses. One camera, positioned less than a mile from 1122 King Road, captured a white sedan driving back and forth in the area multiple times during the early morning hours. The car returned again at approximately 4:04 a.m., made several passes near the victim's house, and then was seen speeding away at around 4:20 a.m. Investigators identified the vehicle as a white Hyundai Elantra, model years 2011 to 2016. At the time, it seemed like a small detail. It would become central to the case. The decision to publicly request information about the Elantra was not made lightly. Law enforcement understood the risk of alerting a suspect, but the volume of data was overwhelming. Tens of thousands of tips poured in after the announcement. Among them, one detail quietly stood out. A campus police officer at Washington State University, located just 8 miles away in Pullman, had previously noted a white Hyundai Elantra registered to a graduate student named Bryan Kohberger. The car matched the model, and year range investigators were seeking. From there, the investigation narrowed not through intuition, but through confirmation. Analysts began reconstructing the Elantra's movements using camera footage from multiple locations. The pattern was unsettling. The vehicle appeared to travel from Pullman toward Moscow in the hours before the murders, moving along a route consistent with late-night driving and minimal traffic. After the killings, it returned to Pullman using a different path, possibly an attempt to avoid detection. The driving behavior itself suggested consciousness of guilt, repeated passes near the house, late-night timing, sudden acceleration after departure. Parallel to the vehicle analysis, investigators turned to cellular data. Kohberger's phone records would later reveal a pattern that prosecutors argue is damning. In the months before the murders, his phone pinged cell towers near the victim's house on at least a dozen occasions, almost always late at night or early in the morning. There was no known social connection between Kohberger and the 4 students. No evidence of friendship. No confirmed reason for him to be in that neighborhood so frequently. The implication was difficult to ignore. On the night of the murders, Kohberger's phone was active until approximately 2:47 a.m., then went dark, either turned off or placed in airplane mode just before investigators believed the Elantra left Pullman. The phone remained inactive during the window in which the murders occurred. At 4:48 a.m., the phone turned back on south of Moscow, connecting to cell towers as the vehicle traveled away from the crime scene. For investigators, this gap in data was not a shield. It was a signal. In a case built on timelines, silence can be as loud as movement. Then there was the DNA. At the crime scene, among the devastation, forensic technicians recovered a single, easily overlooked item, a tan leather knife she found on a bed near two of the victims. It did not belong to anyone who lived in the house. On its snap, analysts found a trace of male DNA. The amount was small, but modern forensic science requires only fragments. Through genetic genealogy and subsequent testing, the DNA was linked to Bryan Kohberger. To strengthen the match, investigators later recovered DNA from trash collected outside his parents' home in Pennsylvania. The profile was consistent with being the biological father of the person whose DNA was on the sheath. The statistical likelihood of coincidence was astronomically low. Each piece of evidence on its own could be explained away. A car like that is common. Cell phone pings can be imprecise. DNA transfer can happen indirectly, but together, the data told a coherent story. A man who studied crime patterns. A car that moved in the dark. A phone that went silent at the worst possible moment. A knife sheath left behind at a murder scene. Investigators also examined Kohberger's behavior after the murders. He returned to class. He spoke with classmates. He graded papers. To those around him, nothing seemed overtly unusual. But inside law enforcement files, another pattern emerged. Surveillance footage showed the Elantra being cleaned thoroughly. Kohberger changed his vehicle registration from Pennsylvania to Washington shortly after the killings. He drove cross-country with his father weeks later, an ordinary act that took on ominous weight once the investigation became known. These were not the actions of a mastermind flawlessly evading justice. They were the actions of someone attempting control after chaos, making adjustments, correcting perceived risks, unaware that the most damaging evidence had already been captured. In the age of digital surveillance, the crime itself may be fleeting, but the aftermath is permanent. For the families, this phase of the investigation was agonizing. They knew progress was being made, but not how close authorities were. Grief coexisted with hope, then with anger. The knowledge that the killer might be living freely, attending classes, sleeping in his own bed, intensified the pain. Every day without answers felt like another injustice layered onto first. What ultimately defined the stage of the case was not brilliance, but inevitability. The killer did not need to confess. The evidence did not rely on memory or emotion. It relied on systems designed to observe, record, and connect. Bryan Kohberger, the man who studied criminals, would soon learn the most unforgiving lesson of all. Crimes are not solved by what the killer plans, but by what he overlooks. Bryan Christopher Kohberger did not stand out in the way people expect a violent offender to stand out. There were no public outbursts, no known history of violent crime, no dramatic warnings that could easily be pointed to in hindsight. Instead, what made him unsettling was a contrast between who he appeared to be and what prosecutors allege he did. He was a criminology PhD student at Washington State University, a man immersed in the academic study of criminal behavior, forensic methods, and the psychology of offenders. If the allegations are true, he was studying the mechanics of crime while preparing to commit one. Kohberger's academic path had been focused and deliberate. He had earned degrees in psychology and criminal justice before enrolling in the doctoral program. Classmates described him as intense, sometimes socially awkward, and deeply interested in how criminals think. At one point prior to the murders, he had participated in a research project that asked participants about their emotions and thoughts while committing crimes, questions about planning, execution, and feelings afterward. At the time, it appeared academic. After his arrest, it felt chilling. This background reshaped how the public viewed the case. The killings were no longer just a brutal act of violence. They became a study in contradiction. How could someone trained to analyze criminal mistakes allegedly commit a crime riddled with them? The answer may lie not in intelligence, but in psychology. Knowledge does not erase impulse. Education does not guarantee restraint. In some cases, it can foster overconfidence. Investigators began scrutinizing Kohberger's behavior in the weeks before and after the murders. There was no evidence of a personal relationship with the victims. No messages. No shared social circle. That absence raised troubling possibilities. Prosecutors would later suggest the victims were targeted without knowing their killer reality that deepened the horror for their families. Being chosen at random, or for reasons that may never be fully explained, is a particularly cruel form of violence. After the murders, Kohberger did not flee the country or vanish into obscurity. He continued his routine. He attended classes. He interacted with professors. This outward normalcy has often been misinterpreted as proof of innocence, but criminologists note that maintaining routine can be a coping mechanism. For some offenders, normalcy is camouflage. For others, it is denial. At the same time, subtle changes drew attention. Kohberger reportedly became more guarded. His car, already on investigators' radar, was meticulously cleaned. His appearance shifted slightly. He stopped participating as actively in discussions. None of these actions are crimes. But when viewed through the lens of what investigators already suspected, they took on new meaning. One of the most striking elements of this case is the irony of expertise. Kohberger was allegedly familiar with forensic evidence, yet left behind DNA. He understood surveillance, yet drove his own car through a residential neighborhood multiple times. He knew the value of digital footprints, yet carried a phone that betrayed his movements. These were not the errors of ignorance. They were the errors of assumption, the belief that preparation alone could control outcome. There is also the question of motivation, which remains officially unanswered. Prosecutors have not publicly articulated a clear motive, and defense attorneys have argued that speculation should be avoided. In the absence of explanation, the public has filled the void with theories. But the legal process demands restraint. What matters in court is not why someone commits a crime, but whether the evidence proves they did. For the victims' families, Kohberger's background added another layer of anguish. The idea that their children may have been observed, studied, or chosen by someone analyzing crime academically is profoundly disturbing. It strips away any comforting narrative of randomness or mistake. It suggests deliberation without empathy, planning without remorse. Kohberger's arrest in December 2022 ended weeks of fear, but began a long legal journey. Extradited from Pennsylvania, he appeared in court expressionless, his demeanor scrutinized frame by frame. Silence became his defining feature. He did not offer explanations. He did not address the families. The absence of visible emotion fueled both condemnation and debate. Yet silence itself is not evidence. The justice system rests on proof, not perception. And as disturbing as Kohberger's profile may be, the case against him ultimately stands or falls on facts. Those facts, DNA, digital records, surveillance, do not care about personality or academic interests. They speak in timestamps and probabilities. What makes this section of the story so unsettling is not just who Kohberger is, but what he represents. He challenges the assumption that understanding crime prevents it. He forces a confrontation with the uncomfortable truth that knowledge can coexist with violence, and that studying human behavior does not exempt one from its darkest impulses. The trial will determine guilt or innocence. But the psychological dissonance at the heart of this case of a criminology student accused of committing a brutal, intimate crime has already left a permanent mark on how the public understands criminal behavior. It is not always chaotic. It is not always impulsive. Sometimes, it wears the face of someone who believes he knows better. By the time Bryan Kohberger stood formally accused, the case had already reshaped the lives of everyone connected to it. For prosecutors, it became a matter of assembling evidence into a narrative strong enough to withstand relentless scrutiny. For the defense, it became a fight to dismantle that narrative piece by piece. For the families of Kaylee Goncalves, Madison Mogen, Xana Kernodle, and Ethan Chapin, it became something far more personal, a slow, exhausting wait for accountability in a system that moves far more carefully than grief allows. The arrest itself did not bring closure. It brought silence, court filings, and an avalanche of legal procedure. Kohberger was charged with 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of burglary. The severity of the charges reflected the brutality of the crime, but they did not answer the most painful questions. Nothing in the courtroom could restore what was lost. Justice, even if fully served, would arrive too late to save 4 lives already frozen in memory. As details of the evidence became public through court documents, the strength of the prosecution's case appeared to rest on convergence rather than any single dramatic revelation. The DNA on the knife sheath placed Kohberger at the scene. The surveillance footage placed his car in motion. The phone records mapped intent and opportunity. Together, they formed a timeline that prosecutors argue is both precise and unforgiving. This was not a case built on speculation or coerced confession. It was built on accumulation. Yet the defense pushed back forcefully, challenging the interpretation of each element. They questioned the reliability of cell tower data, the handling of DNA evidence, and the absence of eyewitnesses who could identify Kohberger inside the house. They emphasized what was missing: no murder weapon recovered, no blood found in Kohberger's car publicly disclosed at the time of arrest, no direct explanation of motive. In the American legal system, doubt is not a weakness, it is a requirement. Outside the courtroom, the community of Moscow struggled to redefine itself. The house on King Road was eventually demolished, not to erase memory, but to relieve a physical wound that could not heal while standing. Vigils continued. Scholarships were created in the victims' names. Students returned to class carrying an awareness they did not have before that violence can arrive quietly, without warning, even in places built on trust. The broader impact of the case extended beyond one town. Law enforcement agencies across the country pointed to it as an example of modern investigation, how digital evidence, when responsibly collected and interpreted, can solve crimes that once might have gone unsolved. At the same time, privacy advocates raised concerns about surveillance, genetic databases, and the expanding reach of forensic technology. The case became a crossroads between safety and civil liberties, a reminder that progress always carries consequence. For true crime audiences, the phrase killer mistakes often carries an undertone of fascination. But in reality, those mistakes are not clever plot twists. They are the difference between impunity and accountability. They are not satisfying. They are tragic because they exist only after irreversible harm has been done. In this case, the mistakes did not undo the crime. They only ensured that it would not remain hidden. The family spoke when they could and fell silent when they could not. Grief is not linear, and neither is justice. Court dates were scheduled and postponed. Motions were filed. Each procedural step reopened wounds. For parents, siblings, and friends, the legal process felt cold and abstract compared to the reality of absence, empty bedrooms, unanswered phones, milestones that would never be reached. What lingers most powerfully in the aftermath of this case is not the identity of the accused, but the fragility it exposed. For students did nothing extraordinary that night. They did not provoke violence. They did not seek danger. They lived as millions of others do, trusting that home meant safety. That trust was violated in the most intimate way possible. Whether Bryan Kohberger is ultimately convicted or not will be decided by a jury weighing evidence under law, not by public opinion. But the story of the Idaho Student Murders has already delivered its harsh lesson. Knowledge does not equal control. Planning does not eliminate error. And no amount of intellectual distance can strip violence of its human cost. In the end, this case is not about a criminology student or investigative techniques. It is about 4 young people whose lives ended in the dark, and a community forced to reckon with the reality that some losses are permanent. Justice may speak in verdicts and sentences, but grief speaks in memory, and that, unlike a trial, has no end date.